Welcome back, everyone, here at the Zero Carbon Future Pavilion, where we investigate the hard questions at the nexus of energy access, energy security, and climate change in a world of polycrisis. This is the second panel on carbon capture and storage of the day. We already had a really exciting conversation this morning with regional experts from the US, Europe, and the Middle East on the region-centric strategies for commercializing carbon capture and storage technologies. As many of you know, it's a vital building block for industrial decarbonization, pathways to carbon dioxide removals, as well as asset transformation. And I think I want to start with a few key takeaways and why it's so important that we host this next discussion, Unlocking Carbon Capture Finance in Emerging Economies, and the role of development institutions as a follow-up to our earlier conversation. So earlier we highlighted there's a new narrative out there, a new political economic narrative for deploying carbon capture and storage in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. It's about jobs. It's about reducing the cost of these technologies, enabling learning by doing, enabling CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, and thus shortening the deployment timelines. So now we're going to talk about how are we going to enable the deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies in the rest of the world, particularly in the global south and emerging markets. Earlier this year at a DOE hosted ministerials, actually this was a big topic. We discussed the need for reforming climate finance to be available for all clean energy technologies, not just favored technologies. We also discussed the need for global cooperation and enabling indigenous innovation in next mover markets. For example, my colleague Lily Ordano likes to say, she leads our Africa program, Africa has often been seen as a consumer of technology, but we really want to enable indigenous innovation and ensure that really, and I think Assistant Secretary Crabtree said it earlier, carbon management is a building block for energy access. So with this, I'm really honored to introduce my next panel. I'll start to the left of me, to the right of you, Kamel Ben Nasser, who's the president of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and also the international director and CEO of Nomadia Energy. Galoran Turan, who's the general manager for advocacy at the Global CCS Institute, and Tim Dixon, who's the general manager and director of the International Energy Agency Greenhouse Gas Program. So with this, I also would like to encourage the audience to think about questions already. This is supposed to be a very interactive conversation. If you have questions, please signal to me. I'm happy to roam and come to you. Please also tweet at us with the hashtag #ZeroCarbonFuture at CleanAirCATF. So maybe, Galoran, we can start with you. You recently released your flagship report, The Global Status of Carbon Capture and Storage. And we've seen a 40% increase in carbon capture and storage capacity announcements over the past year. Again, another record year. Can you tell us a little bit about the status? Where's carbon capture and storage in emerging markets and developing economies?
Thanks very much, Lee, and thanks to the Clean Air Task Force for bringing us together today. The previous session was amazing, and we're going to kind of now discuss another important aspect of deploying carbon capture and storage in developing countries. As Lee said, we released our Global Status of CCS report back in October, and a phenomenal growth of more than 40% in the project pipeline of projects in operation and in various different stages of development, with 30 commercial CCS facilities operating around the world and some more than 140 in various different stages of development. Currently, we have the capacity to capture and store a little bit more than 40 million tons of CO2 per annum, and the full pipeline has a capacity of around 250 million tons per year or so, if it gets, as and when it gets developed. So when we look at emerging or developing economies, we have a number of countries with CCS facilities. Of course, the oldest one is probably the In Salah facility in Algeria, which has completed its operations, but it was really instrumental in demonstrating the safe storage of CO2. And then we have facilities, for example, in Brazil, that's Petrobras operating, and also in China. Now, these first facilities are all in gas processing, and that's important because basically natural gas, in order to meet pipeline specifications, has to be stripped of CO2. So gas processing happens to be one of the lowest cost opportunities for CCS deployment. Hence, of course, the first applications of CCS in these developing countries were in gas processing, harnessing the low-hanging fruit. When we look forward, we indeed see gas processing being deployed in countries such as Malaysia, such as Indonesia, but we're also seeing new applications of CCS. For example, ethanol production in Brazil, or fertilizer production in Indonesia, or for that matter, petrochemicals in China. And one of the questions that people, and in fact it came about in the previous panel as well, is what about power generation, and what about using CCS in power generation? So in China, there are 2 projects on coal-fired power generation, which we expect to sort of go for FID next year probably, and that's quite relevant because China, as we know, moves at China speed. The previous project that came online in China earlier this year, it took 18 months from FID to being kind of deployed. So we think that that's an important application and development to watch out for.
Thank you very much. Tim, going over to you, what's from your perspective, the status? You're also hosting a conversation about this topic later this week, zooming into the Caribbean region.
I'm trying to think of the question to provide an answer to on that. I think what's really important for these emerging economies is establishing a centre of excellence in them that can act as a core and a focus and a centre of expertise for them to refer to. We see some good examples of that already in Indonesia with its Centre of Excellence, in South Africa with Senedi and the Centre of Excellence, and we nearly had one in Mexico as well. And that links across to the multilateral development banks. The World Bank and the Asian Development Bank can fund those centres. And I can say a bit more about the role of those centres later on, but they help to get those countries moving. They start with the capacity development in human resource capacity building, but also in the capacity assessment for storage. So what we do is try and encourage this knowledge transfer, technology transfer, and also the South-South learning between these countries as well, which is what we've been doing at this COP with our event last week on CCS in Africa, sharing African countries' experiences with other countries, and in this Pavilion Clean Air Task Force, thank you, tomorrow, in CCS in the Caribbean, sharing the expertise that started there with other countries in that region.
Thank you so much, Tim. So really important to capture. Galoran talked about the existing projects, a variety of projects in a variety of industries, but also we're seeing the emergence of carbon management centers of excellency who really help us with indigenous and local innovation. So maybe, Kamala, I can go over to you. What's the status of MDB financing for carbon capture and storage globally? Or how do you see this sector evolve moving into the next stage of our conversation?
Thanks very much for the invitation. I wanted just to pick up a little bit on what Tim was saying about the necessity to develop the knowledge in emerging economies in CCUS. If we go back, and I've been in CCUS now for more than 20 years, what we have seen are incredible efforts in North America. So we have, for instance, the Global Atlas of storage developed for North America that gave quite a good understanding of what were the good sites to store in Europe, in US and Canada. We also had a similar effort in Europe funded by the European Commission in terms of characterizing pore space in Europe. Unfortunately, we do not have that level of knowledge outside of those regions and in Australia and New Zealand. So we need to make sure that we develop that knowledge, and this will be a great facilitator. You mentioned the portfolio of projects. I'm sure that we could accelerate the pace of those projects if we had a good knowledge base on what kind of subsurface facilities we could have for storage. I want to applaud the recent initiative to characterize the pore space in the MENA region. And this was a report that was published by Gaffney Klein and AFRI, which gave 170 gigatons of CO2 pore space available in the Arab Gulf. Personally, I think that number is very, very low compared to the real potential. And there should be a great work to be done to do that. And we can pour the resources, the human resources, the human talent. I'm currently presiding the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and we have great resources in terms of people to do this type of analysis. So that's just coming back to. Now, on your question, Lee, on the role of MDB, I think that we have seen a certain number of them supporting. For instance, the EIB has been very much supporting efforts in places like the first project that was mentioned on the Insala that you mentioned in Algeria. We would like to see more efforts from the organization like the World Bank. Today, most of the efforts that we see from the World Bank are more on the renewable energy through the IFC, but also through the interconnections, digitalization, and so on. We do not see enough efforts from those MDBs in terms of funding those CCUS projects. And if we look at where we go, coming back to the excellent report done by GCCSI, let's look at the challenge. We have, according to the net zero emission scenario, we need 5 billion tons. 5 billion tons globally compared to 40 million tons today. So we need to scale up by 2 orders of magnitude. And approximately 2/3 of them will come from emerging economies. And so that gives you the scale of the challenge, and where we need financing, we need to have developed knowledge and so on.
Thank you so much. Really, really important points here. And I think I want to home into this. So I think one important aspect you mentioned is if the financing isn't earmarked for carbon capture and storage, it's unlikely to be spent by development institutions or MDBs on carbon capture and storage. So maybe I can go over to you, Goloran, so you can talk a little bit about what's happening in the MDBs, what are the trust funds, and I think they're running out soon, so what are we going to do?
Exactly, and I think it's a major challenge. So actually, financing and helping develop carbon capture projects is very much aligned, or should be aligned with MDB's strategies. In the 2019 joint report on MDB climate finance, it classifies CCS as a technology that should be eligible for climate finance. We know that to date, for example, World Bank, through its trust fund, CCUS Trust Fund, spent around $50 million in Mexico, South Africa, and through its sister organization, IFC, is supporting CCS development in Nigeria. Asian Development Bank has been influential in setting up centers of excellence in a number of locations. So there's been really good work done by a few of and of course the IB, as Kamal mentioned, in a number of developing countries. But the key fact remains that these trust funds, both at the ADB and at the World Bank, are due to expire. I believe ADB by the end of this year, and at the World Bank by the end of next year. So we think it's really important that these should be replenished. And it's also worth noting that CCS is very much in the strategies, decarbonization plans and strategies of a number of the donor countries to these organizations, such as the US, such as UK, Norway, and Japan. MDBs have, I think, quite a critical role in accelerating CCS deployment in developing organizations, in providing finance through grants and large concessional loans and private sector guarantees, but also capacity building. I think that's going to be quite key, and MDBs can bring a wealth of experience to the countries in helping kind of through centers of excellence, etc., with capacity building. So I think replenishing the funds is an urgent must.
Thank you, Galoran. Really important points, particularly capacity building for shortening the deployment timelines. If we're deploying carbon capture and storage over the next decade in advanced economies, we need to lay the pathway for deployment now in next mover markets. So maybe, Tim, I can go over to you. Galoran mentioned the latest IFC investment in Nigeria. What exactly is being done with those funds?
So that's a nice example of what a country does and what these MDBs can do. So this IFC money from the IFC part of the World Bank just started last month. They're going to be, first of all, looking at the CO2 sources in Nigeria and mapping those, and then doing a geological storage assessment of the whole country to look to see whether there's suitable geological storage, and then to do a regulatory assessment to look at the regulations there and whether they're appropriate for carbon capture and storage, particularly the storage aspects. Now, this is a model that the World Bank's run in other countries with success, in South Africa, in Mexico, and they're now starting this in Nigeria. And I mentioned earlier the idea of a centre of excellence as a node of knowledge within that country. And Brad Crabtree, who was here earlier, and Minister Aiko from Nigeria last Friday launched a centre of excellence for carbon management for sub-Saharan Africa to be based in Nigeria. Details to be provided on that yet, but it's a good start to recognise that one will be needed. And these are the very first steps of a country, is to do these sorts of assessments. And Kamel referred to the need on the geological side and the storage assessments. You do need to have the state, the National Geological Survey is a key player in that. That's the repository of knowledge for the country. And what we see is, sometimes they have the knowledge, some knowledge, but often they don't. And the MDB funds can help them get that knowledge. As IAGHG, we have a quick guide on how to start your storage assessments as a country that we provide. It's a report that's freely available, and the banks can use it as a reference point as well. And then there's quite a good track record already from the work that ADB's done in the World Bank, and we have had organisations from the developed countries going in, such as Battelle, University of Texas, British Geological Survey, and more recently the USGS, supported by the US Department of Energy, trying to help the geological surveys in these countries to understand what they need to do to understand their own geology. And just on that last point, in terms of technology transfer between developed countries and developing countries, of course, geological storage capacity isn't so much around technology transfer, it's the country's own national resource. They've got it already, and it's just about helping them to understand whether it's appropriate and how to use it. So there's a really nice aspect to this. It's the country's own national resource that they have to use in terms of geological storage.
Thank you so much. And I just want to capture a really kind of key takeaway from this panel so far, and this is the need for a paradigm shift. A paradigm shift from kind of majority focused renewables financing to all technology option, a paradigm shift toward more kind of south-south collaboration, also non-traditional actors, non-traditional financing, rather this notion of transfer from the global north to the global south. And I want to go to you, Kamel. Recently in The Economist, it said there will be $3.5 trillion extra dollars in the 6 oil and gas producing countries in the MENA region available at current fossil fuel prices. So there will be a lot of capital available. And there's also been recent announcements, the Saudi CCE fund, but also the UAE-US partnership with $100 billion for CCUS, parts of which are supposed to be dedicated to CCUS in emerging markets. How do you see Middle Eastern countries become involved in financing deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies in next mover markets?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously, the first priority is to balance the budget, the fiscal budget, But what we have seen over the last few weeks at ADIPEC about 2 weeks ago in Abu Dhabi, there was an announcement by the UAE for $100 billion of investment in clean energy, and this is jointly with the US. There is also an announcement that was made last week by Saudi about the creation of a hub for CCUS with 9 million tons of CO2 being captured and stored. So these are different initiatives that are being created. Obviously, there are other ones that are related to the NEOM project in Saudi Arabia, the hydrogen hubs that are being created. So all these are part of the transfer of some of those additional funds that are coming from the increased fossil fuel prices to the decarbonization. And what we have seen here in Egypt is a number of agreements signed last week by Egypt in order to decarbonize some of the components of their energy industry. So now, what about financing efforts in other places using some of that funds? What we have heard from Saudi Arabia is the creation of a $1.5 billion fund for accelerating innovation. I think this would be quite interesting if it could help countries from emerging economies develop their own expertise, develop their own ecosystem for technologies like CCUS. So that would be one area. What Tim was talking about, characterizing the subsurface space using the country's own resources, the own knowledge, is something that needs to be done. Obviously, we may need to run some seismic assessment that would complement that. This would be to better characterize the subsurface, but that could be financed relatively cheaply and provide a very good base of knowledge, so that we will take reduce the uncertainty on the storage. And on the methodology at the SPE, the Society of Petroleum Engineers that I'm presiding, we have also developed a new methodology called the Storage Resource Management System with a number of other organizations that will help to quantify the storage space with different probabilistic assessments, P1, P2, P3 in terms of storage.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe we can turn now on where we've really assessed kind of what's the status quo. What are the most important next steps? We've already talked about CO2 storage characterization, but also zooming into the funds. How are we going to replenish them? What are actions stakeholders should take, governments need to take?
Thanks, Lee. And I think this is really important, and Galoran's already referred to this. There's not much capacity building money available for developing countries in CCS. So these trust funds under the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have been really important for these countries to go to. And they are ending, as Galoran said, in the next 12 months, both those funds. And it really does make sense for the donor countries who input to those, which is the UK, Norway and Australia, to replenish those because it matches their national objectives and their national policies as well. But many other countries should be looking at putting in these because it's a global issue that we're dealing with. I think there is some concern about the association of CCS with fossil fuels, and I'm sensing that these countries aren't rushing to replenish these, but it's really important to do this. And CCS is a technology that applies to all large sources of CO2, irrespective of the source. And if we don't have these funds, that's a real gap for countries in terms of their funding of their initial work. We're just talking about the initial work here. The other place to go, of course, is the international climate finance, and the main source of that is the Green Climate Fund. Now, we do know that the Green Climate Fund, in its articles that set it up, has CCS as an explicit example of a technology that should be supported. But we've yet to see the Green Climate Fund fund anything in the CCS space. And that's of concern as well. And we suspect it's because of the association with fossil fuels, but nonetheless it's in there. It's actually strictly called their governing instrument that was agreed in 2011, that they should be funding CCS. Now, for countries to access that, it really helps to have it in either their NDCs. So those of you who are here, think about this. The NDCs at the moment are only looking to 2030, so not so many have got CCS in. It's very easy to put it in your NDC, but it's one way that these climate finance organisations, such as GCF, require this evidence base that the country needs CCS. And the other one is in technology needs assessments. Now, these are funded through the UN under the Climate Technology Centre and Network. And what we've experienced is that some of these, or many of these, are done by Western consultants going into a country with their own perspectives on what should be done, and not necessarily consulting all the stakeholders in the country. And I won't name an example here, but we have one real example of that where CCS is a major technology for that country, and they weren't going to include it until we intervened to make sure that was done. But including CCS in your NDCs and your TNAs, technology needs assessments, it's a good indicator then to the climate finance to open up that. And I think Lauren might refer to the long-term strategies as well. So as well as the NDCs, the Paris Agreement requires countries to submit their low greenhouse gas development strategies looking to the mid-century. Now, most of those have got CCS in because countries are looking at their NDCs, what they can do in the next 8 years to 2030. They're putting the easier to mitigate actions into that. They've got to go beyond that for further mitigation actions to reach net zero by 2050 or whenever their target is. And so 80% of these long-term strategies have CCS in. So that's good. Countries are realizing they really do have to use this technology. So there's several requests in there. The donor countries to think about replenishing the World Bank and ADB funds. For countries who are here in the audience to think about NDCs including CCS. Very easy to do that. And also if you're having a technology needs assessment done on your country, you might not even know it's being done. You should ask and find out and make sure that all relevant technology mitigation options are included.
Just very shortly, I want to very much echo what Tim has said. It's really important for countries to have CCS in their NDCs if they would like to access development finance through MDBs. From a replenishment point of view, the process, I understand, starts with annual consultation process with the donors and events like this that you're hosting. Events like a few months ago, Clean Energy Ministerial CCUS initiative held an online virtual event with several representatives from MDBs and for ourselves. I think we need to raise the awareness with the donor countries in terms of how this is required, why it's required, and I think raising this awareness is kind of going to be key.
And I think this is actually really important what you're mentioning is if donor countries really want to realize the full potential of their investment, we heard it earlier, $12 to $20 billion in the US alone, they need to be thinking about these strategies now, and they need to be making the case for global deployment. A clean US, a clean Europe is not the end game, it's the beginning. Kamal.
Now, to the excellent points made by the panelists, so there is ongoing work at the World Bank to improve the characterization of the carbon content of fossil fuels that are being produced. And this is going through the whole chain. And then eventually define a methodology for cross-border selling of hydrocarbons that would include the carbon content. So eventually this would give a value to the CO2 being captured, and this could be a differentiator. So in terms of, we need to have also financial characterization or financial justification for the producer to use CCUS. And this could be one. So for instance, if I'm selling a barrel of oil from Indonesia, I know what's the carbon content, and then I can price in the cost of abating that CO2 associated with that. So this is something that has to be firmed up, because today it's only mentions and it's not something that is acted upon.
Thank you very much. And also inviting the audience. Are there any questions in the audience? James, I'm coming.
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up that last point and ask, in the longer term, what's the business case? I mean, if we're going to raise finance, there needs to be a source of revenue, I would have thought. And so I guess the question is this a purely domestic issue in terms of capturing carbon in country? Is there a potential export-import business? Is there a carbon tax you envisage which kind of incentivizes companies? What is the ultimate long-term business case once the development finance we've moved beyond development finance?
So that's a great question. And in fact, when we're asked, what's the key challenge? Technology, we know, is not the key challenge, particularly when it comes to capture kit. Easy to kind of locate one way or the other. Clearly storage, we know it exists. As Kamal has been saying, it's important to develop, characterize, etc., but the key challenge to CCS deployment around the world is the availability of a business case. And in the previous panel, as my colleague Mohammed mentioned, business case doesn't have to be kind of based on the same principles in every country. It can be different. We have to bear in mind that the role of CCS exists to decarbonize. That's the only reason why carbon capture and storage exists. So it's really important that emission reductions are valued in some way or the other, I think, around the world, and this can happen through a number of different ways. But that would be sort of a starting point. But I'd also like to emphasize that, for example, in some of the developing countries, sort of state-owned enterprises can play a big role as well. So they can kind of speed up development, they've got capacity. So there are sort of different modes of CCS deployment that can happen. And I think we're probably going to see, hence, sort of different models around the world. But kind of putting a value on emission reductions is really important. And I think kind of that's, at least in the early stages, CCS will be, will be policy driven. We've seen and heard in the previous panel, for example, how US has made such impressive kind of progress with the Inflation Reduction Act, with the carbon tax credit, etc. That's one model. But there are likely to be different models around the different parts of the world. And coming back to my point, perhaps state-owned enterprises in some of the developing countries can play a major role.
Just following on from that, thanks, Lauren, and a good question. And from a country's perspective, they've got to reduce their own emissions, but potentially they could take the emissions of other countries. Now we have the technical aspects of that being proven at the moment with the development of the Northern Lights project in Norway, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but is an offshore storage facility with an onshore facility to receive CO2 by ships. Initially from two sources in Norway, but they had signed 7 MOUs with other countries to take their CO2, and that's an enabling project in that it enables projects that maybe not large enough at the moment to build capture plant and develop storage, enables them to put capture plant on and ship their CO2 to Norway for storage for a fee. I don't know what they charge, but the Norwegians will be charging for taking that CO2 in. And we're seeing that model also being replicated now in Iceland and potentially conceptually in Northern Australia, where there is countries around with CO2 sources, but not necessarily with the geology that is appropriate to store in. Attached to that then, to put a price on carbon, we're developing here in the negotiations in the halls over there, Article 6.2 and Article 6.4, setting up the carbon market frameworks for the future for the whole planet. Potentially, very potentially, there should be rewarding of the carbon reductions through these mechanisms of these projects. So that would add into the business case as well. So a country that doesn't even have a CO2 source, you could imagine, if it has great geology, it could go, hey, we can develop a storage site and receive other countries' CO2 and get paid for doing it. There's all sorts of options around that.
Yeah, thank you. Picking up on those points, I think if you look at now countries that can be hosts for CO2 storage and are fortunate to have that geological storage, the big question is how is the mechanism to provide that storage space, and what kind of prices will be applied to storage space depending on the type of geology. And we are starting to see some early indications from some auctions in the US for storage space, and we are seeing prices around $1 to $1.50 per ton of CO2 being charged for storage space, $1 to $1.50 per ton of CO2. So these are early indications, but obviously it will depend on the geology and so on. But definitely this is something that has to be assessed. And also, I mentioned earlier, this storage resource management system is you need to have a methodology to characterize that pore space. And just wanted to add, if you look at earlier, when the first project were developed, Sleipner, there was a tax in Norway. In Salah that you mentioned, actually there was no tax in Algeria. And actually it was the state company, Sonatrach, with BP and Statoil, that actually took on the cost of capturing the CO2 and storing it. So there was no real business case there. And so you have a variety of different models that could be applied, and we still need clarity there. Because show me the money, that's the big issue.
Thank you, Kamal. And we have more questions in the audience, which I'm coming. One second. I just want to follow up on a point that you've made, which is really important, the role of markets in the long run. And then, of course, the elephant in the room, the future of fossil fuels, right? And we heard from you, Lauren. It's really about reducing the emissions, including methane emissions. And so, you know, thinking about the Middle East region, rich in fossil fuels, but there's markets for low carbon fuels in Europe and other regions. So could this be a model for addressing this long-term question that James has? What's the role of markets?
So for me, if you want to develop a market for low carbon fuels, you need to develop a number of enablers. And enablers include infrastructure. Infrastructure that would be having storage sites for the emissions. And the most obvious way of starting up this infrastructure is with applications from the oil and gas industry to create that. To develop a blue hydrogen industry based on the gas. And this is what countries like the UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia are actually starting to do. So the role of markets there, we need to have the infrastructure that would be a cost reducer. Because if you don't go to a hub type models, you will have a much higher cost of CO2 capture and storage.
Okay. Well, you mentioned that finance is vital for this development of CCS, and I agree. But what about the communication strategy? I mean, financing should go hand in hand with the communication strategy to achieve the acceptance of civil society. So my question is, how can we get and how can we tackle this lack of knowledge, especially in developing countries, about CCS projects and CCS technologies?
Very, very good point and question there. And part of the work that, for example, will be done in Nigeria is stakeholder workshops to start sharing knowledge with relevant stakeholders at a general level in the country. And we've been involved in some of these in other countries as well, such as Trinidad and Tobago. And it's really important to get that awareness raising with the policy makers as well. And that's before you get to identifying a storage site, where obviously you want to engage with the local population to make sure that they're informed, give them a voice. Really important to make this a two-way process at the local level, give them a voice to input to the project as well, make them feel some ownership and involvement in the project. We've got lots of good lessons in this, from mostly good practices, but not always successful in Western countries. I do recommend, when we get to the project level, there's a US Department of Energy best practice guide on stakeholder engagement at the project level, learning from the regional carbon sequestration projects. But those principles can be applied in any country, and I do refer to that. But one of the first early steps is, exactly as you say, have general stakeholder workshops, share the knowledge a bit with people, and empower people to then share the knowledge on within either their professional or their social communities as well. We find this happens coincidentally through our own summer schools. We do these international CCS summer schools, 50, 60 students every year, and they become, once they learn about CCS, they go back to their countries, their institutions and their communities as ambassadors of CCS. We don't ask them to do that, they choose to do that themselves, but we ask them to share the knowledge, and we see that sort of ripple-on effect. So it's an very important process that's sort of been encapsulated in law within the US now. So don't know why I'm pointing to you, because you're not from the US, but this just is 40 now, that 40% of US DOE's money on clean energy has to go to the communities around the sites. So it's really been put into practice in the US in a big way, that other countries could learn from that as well.
Now, that's a key question, is getting the buy-in from the local stakeholders. And so there is a whole body of knowledge about communication related to CCUS. Tim mentioned the US, but there was also in Europe something called the Zero Emission Platform, the ZEP platform, which did a remarkable job in terms of communicating with the different stakeholders. And personally, I was involved in the first experience they did in France. It was a land project in the Lac field in the south of France. So there were many concerns about the impact of CO2 and so on. And so what we did, we took a sample of 70 people from the local population. And we took them for 3 days to tell them about CCUS. But these people initially had absolutely no knowledge of energy, about carbon capture and so on. And so for 2 days, we had presentation from different sides, first explaining to them what was at stake, and then we had also the possible solutions. So we had people that would tell them CCUS is good, and we had people like Greenpeace that would tell them absolutely no way. And so for the third day, we let them brainstorm among themselves. And we, at the end of the third day, we asked them, is CCUS a good solution? Is acceptable solution? And guess what? 100% of those 70 people said, yes, this is a good solution. Why? Because they had a balanced perspective from people that were for and against, that used layman's terms to explain that. So there is a whole body of knowledge on how to communicate and get local acceptance.
Thank you both to Tim and to Kamal and Kamal. And I just wanted to add that I think it's really important to be clear about the local community benefits to local communities and those involved. As we heard in the, again, excellent previous panel, there's a lot to do with job creation, just transition, keeping and retaining and creating new jobs, which I think is really important. Also the fact that, as Dr. Friedman mentioned, the fact that CCS helps with local air pollution, cleaning up, because you have to kind of clean the chimney from the installation. And again, just to sort of support the points, local communities, Tomakomai project in Japan, Northern Lights in Europe, have excellent visitor centers. They engage with communities, they open their doors. So kind of being open and transparent and welcoming communities. This is not a secret project that's going on in their next door. So I think that's also something that's really important.
Well, thank you very much. Are there any other questions in the audience? Are there any other? Oh, I thought I saw a hand. Any other thoughts from the panel? I think we covered a lot of ground. I'm happy to make an attempt at summarizing. And I think this community has a lot of homework, especially from Galoran, on how we're really going to kickstart financing of carbon capture and storage in next mover markets. So I think the first most important thing we identified is, okay, we are seeing with the first panel, we are seeing region-centric strategies, we are seeing real funding behind carbon capture and storage deployment, and we're seeing also a faster evolution of policy to enable faster deployment, particularly in the US and Europe. However, we still need to work on a larger paradigm change. The first one is really moving away from this idea that this is just technology transfer from the north to the south, but there's multiple players that can be active. South-South collaboration. We want to move away from renewables versus fossil fuels to a more optionality-driven approach to financing overall. And we also want to welcome new players, such as the Middle East, and in enabling this next generation infrastructure. And I think then our homework is really with the ADB fund running out at the end of this month already, and the World Bank CCUS Trust Fund running out next year, is to really work with donor countries that have unparalleled policies and investment in carbon capture and storage to unlock that global impact of this investment by replenishing these trust funds to enable capacity building, CO2 transport and storage, as well as sources scoping, and then work with countries on NDC inclusion. I think we have seen a light update of NDCs this year, so we want to work with countries to really reflect carbon capture and storage in their NDCs. And also tech needs assessment, I think, is what Tim mentioned. So there's a lot for us to do as a community. And then moving from there, I think I just want to highlight a few other pieces, and this is the need for CO2 storage assessments globally, but also the agency of local communities, of countries, and kind of really down to the plant level in how these technologies will be deployed, and really ensuring that there's a clear understanding of the benefits and trade-offs as we're moving towards building this infrastructure. So with this, I just want to thank this really unparalleled panel, and rounding out this morning on carbon capture and storage. We're going to continue the carbon capture and storage discussion later in the Bologna Pavilion, and here at Zero Carbon Future, we're going to welcome our next conversation on methane in just about an hour. We're going to talk about financing methane globally, how we're going to implement the Global Methane Pledge, as well as methane mitigation in the Americas. So thank you all for your engagement, your questions, and we're looking forward to seeing you in an hour.